We have Michael Hyatt back in the house today. Come on, put your hands together for the great Michael Hyatt. Michael is an author. Honestly, he was an enabler of authors. He was the head of Thomas Nelson Publishing for a long, long time. Now he's a best-selling author, a New York Times best-selling author. He's more than that. About 500,000 people go through his website for leadership training and all kinds of ideas that will help you with everyday life. And Michael has a brand new book that's coming out next Tuesday, but his team has graciously worked it out where we could get the book before it's available to anyone else on the planet. And so we get to have it today with us here, and then it'll be in the bookstore. The bookstore worked all night with Michael's COO, who's with us, Megan, and they were able to get all that stuff here for us. We know you're going to want this book because we've asked Michael to speak a little bit out of some of the principles of this book. This brand new book, Living Forward, that will be released next Tuesday, all right? But he's going to speak to us about that a little bit today, not about the book, but about the principle, the driving principle in the book. And then after that, it will be available to you. I do want to just say, since she is here, Megan, Michael's COO of his entire organization, also happens to be his daughter. Megan, thanks for making this happen. I know that Michael only speaks about 5 or 6 times a year. It's a big deal for us to get to have him. We're grateful to you. Can we welcome Megan as well, right? All right, come on, put your hands together, everybody. The great Michael Hyatt. Thanks, David. You can have a seat.
It was the perfect day for fishing. I was about 6 years old. I was with my dad, 70 degrees on a beautiful small lake in western Nebraska. Perfect day for fishing. We only brought about 20 crappie or 20 minnows with us that day. We weren't that optimistic, but I did have my lucky khaki shorts on and my trusty red cowboy boots. And my dad had a white t-shirt, khaki shorts, and his standard issue black dad socks and some old dress shoes. And I mean, every cast into that lake, we caught a fish. And we quickly went through those 20 minnows. So my dad, being very creative, sat down on a rock, cut off a piece of his t-shirt, put it on the hook. I threw it into the lake and caught a fish. The fish didn't know the difference. We must have caught 100 fish that day. And at the end of the day, my arm was so tired, but my heart was so full. It was an idyllic day. Well, my dad taught me some really important lessons. He taught me how to build model cars and planes and trains, and he taught me some of my very first lessons on creativity and the importance of perseverance and patience when you're trying to be creative. And one of the things I still can remember him saying to me is, "Son, don't force it. Let it click into place." He also insisted that I join the Boy Scouts. You know you've survived a lot of therapy when you can show a picture like that in front of 13,000 people and not cower. But he helped me get some merit badges in camping and canoeing and leatherworking and stamp collecting and some other things. But eventually, I discovered girls. And one of the things that I noticed in my observant sort of adolescent mind is that the guys that seemed to be getting the hottest chicks were baseball players. I know. But my dad bought me my very first baseball mitt. I can still smell that leather. He taught me to pitch and to catch, to bat. And even though all the other parents were yelling at our games, I don't remember my dad ever missing a game. I could still hear his voice over the crowd saying, "Son, you can do it. Go for it." And just cheering me on. It was awesome. And so I had this idyllic childhood where my dad was my constant companion. my ever-present friend, my guide. But then as I moved into the teenage years, something happened. My dad took a job as a traveling salesman trying to make ends meet for our family. And he was away a lot, sometimes for a week at a time, sometimes many weeks at a time. And I also noticed during this time that my dad began to drink. And so I would often come home from school, and when my dad wasn't traveling, when he was home, there he would be, passed out on the couch, a six-pack of beer cans, sometimes more, empty around him. And the time when I felt like I needed my dad the most, he wasn't there. And I don't know all that was going on at his life at that time, but I know and felt the absence of my father. Well, as his life careened out of control and his drinking escalated, I thought, you know what? Two can play at this game. I myself began drinking at the age of 14. And then at age 16, I smoked my first joint. And my best friends were so angry with me when they heard about this that they cornered me in the parking lot of my school, threw me up against a car, and my best friend, nose to nose with me, said, if you ever do this again, you will answer to us. I had all those guys smoking weed by that next Friday. That's when I first suspected that I might have the gift of leadership. Perverse, I know. That laugh was worth the whole thing. But it was tough. And as my dad drifted, I drifted. And this all came to a head one night in my senior year. My sister and I were out with some friends, and we came in past midnight. I never had a curfew growing up. I'm not sure why, but I didn't. So we came in past midnight. My friends were laughing. We were laughing. They left us off in the front yard. And we walked up to the house, and there we saw, as we got closer to this dark object, to our horror, there was my father on the sidewalk, passed out. Now my friends who had been laughing with us were laughing at us. And my sister and I were embarrassed. We were humiliated. And as we knelt down and picked up my father and helped him stumble to the house, we got increasingly angry. We put him on the sofa where he went to sleep and began snoring, and my sister, crying, went to her bedroom, and I stood in the shadows looking at my father, and I said to myself, I will never be like that. And that silent vow became the driving force of my life. I had really long hair then, but almost immediately I got it cut off, put on a suit, and got down to business. When I was in college, I was the kid that got up at 5 a.m. to study. I talked the librarian at Baylor University into giving me a study carrel, which was usually only reserved for graduate students, to give that to me because I wanted to treat school like it was an office. When I wasn't in class, I was in my study carrel studying. When I got out of college, I took a job as a salesman because I knew that's where the money was. And my family had always struggled with money, and I thought, this is a way to fix everything. And I was very aggressive. I made more money the first year out of college as a salesman than my dad ever made in a single year. And I was proud of myself. But I was driven. And after a while, that began to show up. I went through a massive business failure in the early 90s. My family floundered, and my health faltered. And I was at a place where something had to change. And I think these two ways of living, represented by my father and myself, represent two ways that you and I can approach life. There's, first of all, the life of drifting, where we're not really choosing the destinations, we're just like a cork in the current, drifting along. My wife Gail and I had been married for about 10 years. We'd never really had a serious vacation, so we saved our pennies, our airline miles, and we went to Hawaii for this vacation. We were so excited, but when we got there, we spent everything we had to get there, and when we got there, we were broke. We had just enough money to do maybe a few things, but not much, and we noticed that the hotel was offering snorkeling lessons. So we met the instructor in the swimming pool, we got checked out, we went onto the reef, and we were blown away by what we saw. We thought, this we can do all week. So we rented some snorkeling gear for about $10. The next morning, Gail and I went to the lagoon that was adjacent to the hotel. It was early, not another soul out there. The water was calm, crystal clear, like glass. We slipped into the lagoon, put on our mask and our snorkeling gear, and began to paddle around, totally distracted by what we saw. Beautiful, multicolored fish, the seaweed and the light playing. It was like swimming in an aquarium. And about 45 minutes later, I decided to look up and realized that we had been caught in a riptide and swept out to sea. The hotel looked like a toy in the distance. Gail raised her head up, gasped, and said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "I don't know what to do, but swim for all we're worth." And we had a boogie board with us, fortunately. We both grabbed that, and we swam hard for about an hour, got to the beach, crawled up, exhausted, and collapsed. And until last fall, I hadn't been snorkeling since. But that kind of represents how a lot of people live. And here's the deal about drifting. When you drift, you never end up at a destination you would have chosen. But there's another way of being, and that's to be driven. And that's what my life really represented. Where I took control, I was going to absolutely white knuckle my way through it, and I was going to achieve something and make something of myself. But that didn't end well either. But here's the funny thing. Both of these ways of being, drifting or being driven, are really two halves of the same coin, something I call the default life. They have more in common than you would think. They seem like polar opposites, but they're not really. Both of them are unconscious ways to live. We don't even know why we're doing this. We're just kind of going through the next thing, and we're either being driven or we're drifting. They also both lead to destinations we would not have chosen. But fortunately, there's a third alternative, and the third alternative is the designed life. It's a life where you live with intention, live with purpose, and choose the destinations where you want to end up. And this is really what I cover in the book that I wrote with my good friend Daniel Harkavy, Living Forward. And in the book, we really build it around three questions. And you can live a designed life by answering these three powerful questions. But like really good questions, and this is a warning, these questions may make you a little uncomfortable. You guys ready for it? Okay. Question number one. How do you want to be remembered? This is a question about clarity or about legacy. You know, the myth of our culture says that we're going to live forever, that you will not die. But here's reality. The truth is, you will die. I'm going to die. It's inevitable. It's the one appointment that all of us will keep. I was talking to a friend of mine in the insurance business that's an actuary. By the way, do you know what an actuary is? It's a person that doesn't have the personality to be an accountant. Some of you got that. But I was asking him, I said, I'm going to be speaking to about 12 to 13,000 students, And run the mortality tables on that and tell me kind of what that looks like. And here's what he told me. This is sobering. Let's assume here that there are 13,000 students. One of you will be dead in 92 days. This is just math. 3 of you will be dead in 12 months. 18 of you will be dead in 5 years. Now, I know what you're thinking. Not me. I wonder who it is. But it's a sobering fact that our culture likes to suppress, but it is a truth. We're all going to die. Now, this is a little bit heavy, so I did what any rational person would do, and I decided I got to lighten this up. So I Googled funny tombstone epitaphs. And so one of the first ones that popped up was this one. It said, "I told you I was sick." Another one said, "Well, this sucks." One of my favorites came from Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone, Arizona, and it said this: "Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a .44, no less, no more." Takes a minute. But my very favorite was this one: "Here lies an atheist all dressed up and no place to go." In 2005, my father-in-law passed away, Colonel Sidney Bruce. He spent his entire career in the Air Force, worked at the Pentagon for a number of years. When he left that career, he led the military ministry at Campus Crusade for Christ. An amazing man. And at his funeral, this was back when they were still doing this, it was, the flyover of the jets and the 21-gun salute and all of that. But when we went back to a friend's house after the funeral, it was really interesting to watch what happened, because we pulled out photo albums and we had carousels of slides, an older technology, and we just looked at photos of Papa. And we cried, and we laughed, and we told stories, and it was apparent to me that this was a life well lived. But it also occurred to me that when you and I die, there are going to be conversations about us, what we meant to the various people in our lives who mattered the most. And the cool thing is that we can begin to engineer those conversations now. How do you want, if God forbid you were to die, how would you want your parents to remember you? What about your spouse or your girlfriend or your boyfriend? Or your friends or the people that you go to church with or fellow students or professors? You and I can engineer those conversations now by who we become. There's a quote I want to share with you from Steve Jobs, who interestingly said this 2 years before his death in a commencement speech, almost prophetically. He said, "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life." And as morbid as it sounds, I want to encourage you to contemplate the fact that you're mortal. How do you want to be remembered? This is the question that creates clarity. But there's a second question, and that's this: what is important to you? And this is a question about priorities. Now, the myth in our culture is that you can have it all. But the truth is, you can have anything you want, you just can't have everything you want. And so it comes down to our choices. Where you are today in your health, in your spiritual life, your GPA, your circle of friends, just about everything in life comes down to the choices that you've made up until this point. The really good news is that you can start to make different choices. And your life becomes the sum total of all those choices that you string together. So what's important to you? You probably know what's important to them. You may know, if you have a boss, what your boss's priorities are for you, or maybe a professor's priorities. But I want to ask you, what's important to you? I'm going to tell you, for me, priority number one is God. And I'm sure it is for most, if not all of you. He is the central figure of my life. He is the one that orders my life, the one whom I consider when I'm facing any choice. But my second priority, and this may be a surprise to some of you, is me. Now, why would I say me? Doesn't that sound selfish? No. Here's why I think it needs to be me. Unless I exercise an appropriate amount of self-care, if I don't take care of my health, if I don't get enough sleep, if I don't nurture myself spiritually and emotionally and intellectually, I can't be of any use to anyone else. But what are your priorities? Once you have these priorities nailed down, it can become a great filter for the decisions that you make. About 7 years ago, I was driving my mom from Waco, Texas, where she lived, to Dallas, Texas, to catch a flight. And so we had about an hour and 40 minutes in the car, and I thought, I've never really debriefed with Mom about Dad's drinking. It was kind of a forbidden topic, and by this time I'd had enough therapy that I thought I'm just going to go for it. And so I said to Mom, I just had to know where her head was when all this was happening when we were teenagers. And so I said to Mom, I said, Mom, look, I need to talk to you about something, and I don't want to bring up something that's awkward or that will make you feel uncomfortable, but I'd like to talk about Dad's drinking problem. And she kind of looked at me like she knew this day was going to come, and she'd kind of hoped it wouldn't, but she was ready for it. And so she said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, I just have to know what you were thinking. Why didn't you leave him? And so she began to explain to me. She said, I don't know. She said, I just felt like keeping the family together was really important for you kids. And I just kept hoping that we would get through it. And so I just made that decision. And she started crying. And she said, I just made that decision to stay with Dad because of who he had been and what I believed he could become, and for the sake of you kids. Now, you and I may have made a different decision. But as I heard that, I thought of my own children, my own grandchildren. I have 8. And I thought her decision in that moment to keep our family together created waves, in a good way, that really have been passed on to me and to my children. And it was a decision based on a clear priority. And that was her family was incredibly important. Again, you may have made a different decision. You could argue with it. But here's the point. Once you have a clear set of priorities, it can become a filter for you so that you can say yes to what you should say yes to, and more importantly, no to the things that you should say no to. For somebody like me, who's a recovering people pleaser, this is incredibly important because I get asked to do a lot of things, but not everything serves my priorities. And I want to make sure that I can say no to the lesser things so that I can say yes, a resounding yes, to the things that matter most, to God and to my family. So this question of priorities, when we have clear priorities, what are yours? When we have clear priorities, this gives us courage. If the first question gives us clarity, the second one gives us courage. Warren Buffett said this: the difference between successful people and very successful people is that very successful people say no to almost everything. Courage, based on priorities. But there's a third question. And the third question is this: what single brave decision do you need to make today? What single brave decision do you need to make today? Now, here's what our culture tells us. Culture tells us that we really can't take any action, we really can't move forward until we can see the whole path. You know, we have to know the beginning from the end. But the truth is, what it really boils down to in the nitty-gritty of life is obviously, or usually, just doing the next right thing. And that's usually abundantly clear. But it requires some courage, and it requires some initiative. If you're building a nuclear submarine or building a big building, you probably need to have detailed plans, action plans, Gantt charts, timetables, all the rest. But for most of us, when it comes to our life and to doing the next right thing, that becomes just a fancy way of procrastinating. You know, once I get the plan, then I'll start acting. Once I graduate from Liberty, I'll do what I need to do. But there are probably things that you know you need to do today. Maybe it's a difficult conversation. Maybe it's an email you need to send, a paper you need to write, something that for you today is the single brave decision that will enable you to begin to move forward and to continue the momentum that you've already built. When I was CEO at Thomas Nelson, I became the CEO in 2005, and for a couple of years before the recession, it was glorious. The company was doing incredibly well. But then, right before the recession, we sold the company to a private equity company. And looking back, they put too much debt on the company. That wasn't really clear when they did it because it all worked out on the spreadsheets and on the forecasts. But by the time we got to 2009, in the teeth of the recession, it was abundantly clear. We had laid off about 20% of our workforce, our entire book publishing industry and booksellers were struggling, and it was a difficult time, and we weren't meeting our bank covenants. Now, we were making money, but it was just such that we had to comply with these bank covenants, and we weren't doing that. So I was spending all my time taking calls from investors and mostly bankers who were upset. And so what they insisted that we do, and the board insisted, is that we hire some outside consultants to advise us as to what we should do. And after about 6 weeks of careful study, they came back to us and they said, we think our best advice, and we've seen a lot of companies in this exact situation, is that you need to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy and flush this debt. Get rid of it. Get it off the balance sheet, because you have a viable business, you're making money, you're just strapped with too much debt. Well, that didn't sit well with me. I didn't think it was the right course of action, and largely because people in our culture don't distinguish between Chapter 11 reorganization and Chapter 7 liquidation, and I thought people wouldn't understand and would come to the wrong conclusion. So I was meeting with a consultant friend of mine who said to me, how do you feel about this advice? And I said, I feel terrible. I don't agree with it. And she said, what's your greatest fear? And I said, well, first of all, I fear for the future of our company because I think authors won't understand it. They'll leave our publishing company. Employees will be in turmoil, and we'll have a mess trying to explain this to our industry. She said, is there anything else? And I thought for a minute, and I said, well, honestly, there is. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job if I stand up to the board. She then gave me one of the most helpful pieces of advice I've ever received in my life. And she said this: if you're going to be fired, cause it. And I thought, wow. Because I could just kind of drift along, struggle with this decision they made, keep my mouth shut, and the future of our company, I think, would have been damaged. So I talked with my wife, Gail. She said, look, honey, you do whatever you need to do. That's fine. She said, you go into that board meeting with your head up and do the next right thing. So the next morning, with fear and trepidation, my hands were sweating. I was scared to death. I went into that board meeting. The chairman said, okay, we got to talk about this recommendation from the consultants. We did. And he said, what should we do? And I spoke first. And I said, look, I'm not trying to grandstand here, honestly. But if we make this decision to do this, I have to resign as the CEO. I'm not leading the company through this because I don't believe in it. You could hear a pin drop. Seemed like eternity. It was just a few seconds. But the chairman said, okay, I guess we'll have to find another alternative. That was the end of it. Such a scary decision, and yet it was the fear that played the biggest role, not the reality. And so sometimes we just have to make these decisions when we get outside of our comfort zone. I love this quote from Neil Walsh, who says, life begins at the end of your comfort zone. It does, doesn't it? Outside of your comfort zone is where all the great stuff happens. That's where your prayers are answered. That's where you develop new capabilities. That's where you achieve your dreams. It's outside of your comfort zone. And don't let anyone talk you into staying inside of your comfort zone. Even if you feel fear, do it scared. Well, just quickly. Whoops, I jumped ahead. Just quickly, 3 powerful questions. How do you want to be remembered? What's important to you? And then what single brave decision do you need to make today? And I want to loop back to my dad just for a minute. I want to kind of complete the story with him. So, several years ago, I was fishing with my dad again on a lake. This time it was really hot, really miserable, and we weren't catching any fish. We were just sitting in the boat. And I decided that I would ask him a question that I'd tried to ask many times before, but sometimes he would get mad, sometimes he just would sulk, and this time he made a brave decision and he decided to talk. And I said, Dad, tell me about the war. Okay, get this. My dad, a farmer's son in western Nebraska, at the age of 17 years old, got really gung-ho and patriotic, and with a couple of friends, decided to sign up for the Marines at the age of 17. His parents had to sign for him because he wasn't old enough to sign for himself. He went to boot camp, and then he was shipped off to Korea. This was during the Korean conflict. Nothing really happened for about a year. After a year, he was sitting on his tank after they'd cleaned the guns with a friend, and he was joking with his friend because it was his friend's last day in Korea. And they were saying, you know, you better be careful, take it easy, you want to get back in one piece, etc. Next thing my dad knows, he hears this whistling sound, hears this explosion, feels a concussion, reaches up to his face. It's wet with blood. The next thing my dad remembers is that he woke up 3 months later on a Danish hospital ship where he was being transferred on a gurney over rough seas to an American hospital ship, where he quickly fell back into a coma for another 3 months. He convalesced in Hawaii for almost a year, had severe injuries. To this day, my dad's 82, he limps severely, he's 100% disabled. But at that time, they didn't know about post-traumatic stress disorder. So he came back home, married my mom. 9 months later, they had me. They swear it was legit. And then he tried to make a living. He didn't even have a high school diploma. He tried to make a living, and it was a struggle. And it was in that context, and I'm not excusing it, but it gave me enormous compassion. I don't know how I would have done, not having had therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, being thrown back into the world, suddenly having this huge disability and trying to make a go of it. And as I sat there with my father telling me this story, I felt this enormous sense of compassion because I'd really judged him harshly. And I felt this compassion. And I thought to myself, first time it ever occurred to me, I thought, you know what? He did pretty well with what he was given. Today, he's been sober for over 10 years. He's one of the most consistently positive people I've ever met. He never complains about anything, even though he's in serious pain. And I just want to ask you in closing this morning, how are you doing with what you've been given? Look, here's the deal. This is your life. Go make it count. Stop drifting. Stop being driven. Start designing and begin living forward. Thank you very much.